So my name is Ben Keim, and I teach here at the college in the Department of Classics, which, although it is a fine endeavor, is not where you want to come to read Jane Austen, or study Beethoven, or perhaps over with Professor Detmar rock out to the Eagles. Classics is the home broadly for the study of late antiquity and classics, early ancient and then later Mediterranean studies. So we conceive of the ancient and medieval Mediterranean worlds very broadly. And with a nod to my Lamb's colleague, Professor Wolf, I might introduce this talk for you today. What has Athens to do with Millikan? What is the relevance of ancient Athens, with all apologies to Tertullian, to those of us here today? Or, and going back to my classics roots, I might style this, what can Tellus tell us? Okay, that's Tellus the Athenian, one of the most splendid and famous denizens of antiquity that you've never heard of. Right? Not a Socrates, not an Augustus, but indeed an Athenian citizen, late 7th century BC, who is known to us today simply because of a very famous passage in Book 1 of Herodotus's Histories. Okay? And what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is go back and look at Herodotus's brief paragraph-long account of the life, the death, the glory of Tellus the Athenian, look at it on its own, in its particular context, and unwrap for you all what I think Tellus the Athenian in his life and death can tell us, both as historians and as humans. Okay, so I'd like to get us up to speed on, well, who's this Herodotus, who's Tellus, look at it and a couple of other stories through the lens of ancient history, and then at the very end bring us back into the room and explain why it is that I think Tellus is of and ought to be of some interest to us all. So for the accounts of Tellus, again, we rely exclusively on Herodotus, right, the great historian of the 5th century BC, born at Halicarnassus on the borderlands between the world of Greece and the empire of Persia. He grew up in that milieu. He traveled broadly across the Mediterranean. And the reason that we speak of him today is not simply because of the discipline that he by and large founded, that of history, which itself comes from his inquiries, right? From the anthropological, the political, the various academic studies that he carried out over several decades and brought together in a work that now spans 9 books. Okay? And it's always good practice, whether you're reading an ancient or modern source, to look to the beginning, right? To see what does the author tell you about what they're setting out to do and how they intend to go about doing it. Right? And right at the beginning, Herodotus lets us know that he is interested in recording for posterity the great deeds and achievements of the Greeks and of their neighbors, the barbarians, not least so that they don't go without glory, that they are not akleia, that they are forgotten by posterity. And amongst these deeds and achievements, he's particularly keen in understanding why it was that the Greeks and the Persians came to blows in the war that we often think of as the Persian War, but more balanced might be the Greco-Persian Wars, the early 5th century conflicts between the Greeks and the Persians. And early in the account, right, well before we get to the wars themselves, Herodotus introduces us to Croesus, the leader of Lydia, a very wealthy area on the coast of modern-day Turkey, Asia Minor. And into the courts of Croesus comes Solon, right, a wise man. Even today you might read the New York Times and hear a slightly different force, someone described as a Solon. But this Solon, an early archaic lawgiver of Athens, set out some reforms, left them in place, and then went out to tour the Mediterranean. Right? He stopped at the court of the Pharaoh in Egypt and then found his way to Croesus in Lydia. And Solon was there for a few days, Herodotus tells us, and exploring, enjoying the wealth of opportunities that Croesus offered him. And then Croesus brought him in, right, sort of gesturing at all of the grandeur around him, and asked Well, Solon, right, your reputation precedes you. You are wise, you are well-traveled. Who is the most prosperous of men? And at that point, Solon, perhaps rather surprisingly, certain to Croesus' surprise, Tellus the Athenian. Okay? So here early on in this great account of Greco-Persian affairs, we have a meeting between an Athenian wise man and the ruler of Lydia, right? A question about who is the most prosperous, the most fortunate, and into this strides Tellus. Okay? Now what I'd like to do now, right, at the next stage, is try to explain why I find, as an ancient historian, as a historian who focuses on the experiences and the discourses of Athenian democracy, why I find the following paragraph and its twin immediately thereafter so compelling. Okay? And then we'll come back to why I think all of you, historians or not, ought to take similar interest in it. Okay? Solon says, Tellus the Athenian. Croesus, taken aback, immediately goes, Koia! On what grounds do you judge him to be the most prosperous? Solon then unfolds in some detail the grounds on which he's made this claim. And it's a wonderful 5th century, put into the mouth of an earlier figure, assessment of what the good life of prosperity, of fortune looks like. So what does he tell us, right? If you were to ask a 5th century Athenian, what might the good life look like? Not in theory, but in practice. Well, Solon rattles off a variety of attributes. First, okay, and certainly not least, Tellus is an Athenian. Right? He comes from no mean city. It's well regarded. Everybody knows about Athens. Then he's had several sons, and they in turn have given him grandchildren. And furthermore, all of his descendants and relatives survive. Right? He's well off, if not by Lydian standards, at least by Athenian. And on top of all of that, Tellus has crowned his life, Herodotus suggests, with a glorious death. Right? He has gone into battle as a hoplite soldier, defending his city-state, the Athenians, against the Eleusinians across the way. He has marked the turning point of the battle, right, where the trophy, in later parlance, would be raised. And then he has died gloriously. The Athenians have gathered his remains, buried him on the battlefield, and last but not least, at Timisain Megalos, they honored him greatly. Thus, you see, Croesus, those are the reasons why he, right, was the most prosperous. Okay? So we look at that, right, in what it tells us about family, about the community, about the way in which a citizen was also a soldier. Right? And it gives us considerable insight and some granularity into the values, the ideals, and the lives, right, of the 5th century Athenians. Croesus isn't satisfied. Right? He immediately, well, okay, fine, fair enough. Right. So who comes second? Cleobus and Biton. Who? I mean, this gets worse and worse. These are not Athenians, right? These are Argives over in the Peloponnese, inveterate enemies of the Spartans. And what's interesting about this story, right, both the similarities and the differences as Solon unfolds his account of why Cleobus and Biton are so fortunate. Okay? They, right off the bat, they are young, they were strong, they were prize-winning athletes. Okay? When they came home one day and found that their mother, a priestess of the goddess Hera, needed to go to the sanctuary, but the oxen hadn't yet come home from the field, they said, we've got this, hooked up the cart and took her over to the sanctuary. Right? Everyone celebrated this. There were plaudits, there were sacrifices. Their mother was filled with joy. They went in to rest, and she, overcome by the honor they had showed her and all the praises the other mothers were foisting upon her, said, okay, let me pray to Hera, to the goddess that I serve, and ask that they be given the best reward. They never woke up. Okay. So both of these stories, right, show us different aspects, right, give us different insights through the window into the ancient Greek past, where we might take up with Cleobus and Biton that this was a world full of gods, right? That their theology mattered in theory and in practice in ways often interwoven with their politics. Okay? It tells us quite a lot, again, about what a fortunate life might look like. And as you'll have noticed, right, these are lives, Herodotus then explains through Solon at greater length, count no man fortunate until he has died, right? Until his death, until he has died well, perhaps gloriously, perhaps otherwise, but nonetheless well, he is merely lucky. Okay? But once you have died well, drawn an end to the account, can be well regarded, then you have shown yourself truly fortunate. Okay? So in looking at those couple of passages, right, embedded, right, a back and forth between Croesus and Solon, two historical figures brought together more than a century later by the historian Herodotus, this early exchange between an Athenian and a neighbor to the east, immediately flags up for us, gives us insight into key aspects of the Greek experience, of their values, of their ideals, and how these ideals might be put into practice. Okay? We have, on the one hand, rather reminiscent of the evil queen in Snow White, right? Croesus striding up to Solon and, wise man, here in my hall, who's the most fortunate man of all? Much like the evil queen, he doesn't get the answer that he's expecting. Okay? But from all of that, right, from unpacking those passages, putting them back, not merely in the context of that exchange, but the broader, from chapter 6 to 92 of book 1 of Herodotus, the overarching account of Croesus of Lydia, who thought himself so prosperous, who pooh-poohed Solon when this advice was given him, only over the next 60 or so chapters to see his fate come sort of apart before his eyes. He realized eventually that Solon had been correct and rather wise as promised. What I find interesting, right, about this account, about its broader context, from a historian's perspective, right, are the answers that it provides, right, to the question, who is most prosperous? Right? That's how the dialogue opens. A couple of chapters later, when Croesus expresses his displeasure, simply not buying it, that's where we get the concept at really the heart of much Greek ethical thought, eudaimonia, right? Human flourishing. What is not merely prosperity, but more broadly, the good life. Right? And that's a term from Herodotus onward, through Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, through the Epicureans and the Stoics, that again is bandied about back and forth. What is the good life? What does it mean to be human? Right? What does flourishing look like? How might it evolve in different places and different times? Okay? So from the historical perspective, right, it's the answers that I find particularly intriguing. The answers that Herodotus, that his Croesus and Solon, that the later philosophers give, those are what are particularly fascinating and help enable the study of ancient history. Right? The ancient experiences of Tellus and his Athenian counterparts, of the Spartans, the Thebans, and the Argives, and so on. The historical perspective, it's the answers that are given that are particularly interesting. But finally, from a broader human perspective, right, it's less the answers, right, and more the reminder of the questions that are being raised, questions that should resonate and continue to resonate with all of us throughout our lives. Okay? Going back to Croesus, right, one might read him as offering a rather narrow, rather materialistic, wealth-determined understanding of human flourishing. Here I am, the ruler of Lydia. And yes, it was Lydia where coinage first came into production, where the locals found electrum, an alloy of gold and silver, and at some point in the 7th century began minting it, putting it into coins, marking it, and using it as currency. Right? So Croesus, in that tradition, drawing on those resources, offers an explanation of success, of well-being, in very material, wealthy terms. Okay? And Solon's responses, right, are not dismissive. Tellus was well off for an Athenian. We're told that Cleobus and Biton were similarly able to take care of themselves. Right? But in Solon's answer, we find a reminder in community, in family, in various aspects of human endeavor, that success can be much more than simply the accumulation of material resources. Okay? And so then in closing, right, whether it's Tellus, whether it's other sources and conversations throughout the ancient and medieval worlds, okay, what I find most compelling about these accounts, about these studies, are the opportunity to study them and their world and their experiences, to take them seriously and to keep their memory alive, just as Herodotus did for Tellus. Okay? But by extension, in engaging with these conversations, engaging with these perspectives, they can help us as individuals, as members of various communities, each of us here and going forward, to bear in mind that conversations need to be had and thoughts need to be expressed about these key terms, about these values, and ultimately, right, what it is that we are living for. Is there anything that is worth dying for? And at the end of the day, right, as we go out bearing our added riches and trust for mankind, what will a life well lived look like? Thank you.